Next item on our agenda is a presentation and proclamation. As you know, this month is devoted to Black history, and I'm going to turn this next portion over to Councilman McKellen, who's going to introduce a video.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we close out the final week of Black History Month, members of this body thought it would be fitting and appropriate to offer a tribute to an African-American man of science, Dr. George Carruthers. Dr. Carruthers made enormous contributions to the United States space program while working as a scientist and an engineer at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. This is his story. George Carruthers, an astrophysicist and engineer, was the principal designer of a telescope that went to the moon as part of NASA's Apollo 16 mission in 1972 in an effort to examine Earth's atmosphere and the composition of interstellar space. Dr. Carruthers, who built his first telescope when he was 10 years old, had a singular focus on space science from an early age and spent virtually his entire career at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. He was one of the country's leading African-American astrophysicists and among the few working in the space program. He began working on his Apollo telescope in 1969 when NASA posted what was called an announcement of opportunity to design experiments for Apollo space flights. Assuming the dual roles of conceptual scientist and practical engineer, he led a team that designed a telescope that could electronically amplify images from space through a series of lenses, prism, and mirror just 3 inches in diameter. Then, by converting photons to electrons, the images could be recorded on film. In 1970, an early model of his telescope was included in an unmanned rocket flight that found the first evidence of molecular hydrogen in interstellar space. When mounted on a tripod, Dr. Carruthers' lightweight magnesium telescope stood about 4 feet high. It was covered in gold plate to protect it from the moon's extreme temperatures. Dr. Carruthers gave instructions to the astronaut John Young, the Apollo 16 commander, on how he should operate the device. On April 21st, 1972, when the lunar module from Apollo 16 touched down on the moon, astronaut Young and fellow astronaut Charles Duke used Dr. Carruthers' telescope to peer deep into space, capturing more than 200 images of Earth's atmosphere, hundreds of stars, and distant galaxies. In essence, it was a planetary observatory on the moon, the first time such a sophisticated telescope has been used by astronauts in space. The observations had far-reaching implications for astronomy, astrophysics, and understanding of how stars are formed. Dr. Carruthers continued to refine his telescopes and develop further experiments at the Naval Research Laboratory for decades. Dr. Carruthers' original Apollo 16 telescope is still on the moon, having been left there when the astronauts returned to Earth in 1972. A replica has been displayed at the Air and Space Museum. George Robert Carruthers was born October 1st in 1939. He built his first telescope out of glass lenses and a cardboard tube. He won science prizes throughout his youth, read science fiction, and was fascinated by space exploration, an idea that was then in its infancy. At the University of Illinois, he received a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering, a master's degree in nuclear engineering, and a doctorate in aeronautical and astronautical engineering. He then became a research physicist at the Naval Research Laboratory, where he worked for 38 years. Beginning in the 1980s, Dr. Carruthers worked extensively with science outreach programs, particularly in schools with large numbers of African-American students. He developed an apprentice program for high school students at the Naval Research Lab and taught summer courses for science teachers in D.C. public schools. When he retired in 2002, he taught Earth and space science for several years at Howard University. Dr. Carruthers received the NASA Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal and was named to the National Inventors Hall of Fame. He also received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, presented by President Barack Obama at a White House ceremony in 2013. Dr. Carruthers seemed surprised when a reporter once asked him whether he had any hobbies. Hobbies, he said. Projects we have here are so varied that it's hardly necessary to have a hobby. Sadly, Dr. Carruthers passed away this past December at age 81. However, in a spectacular example of unintended consequences, Dr. Carruthers may be the only man in history to have a lasting example of his work on the moon, his telescope that was left behind in 1972, where it stands as a monument to his dedication and outstanding contributions to the United States space program. Sarah, if you'd be so kind to give us the video.
Like so many boys growing up in the 1950s, George Carruthers dreamed of the stars.
My interest in space science and astronomy came about by reading science fiction comic books. Of course, that was long before there was a space program, so people weren't really overly enthusiastic, including my relatives, about my interest in astronomy. I was really interested in space from the engineering point of view, having read about it in Wernher von Braun's publication.
At the Naval Research Laboratory, Carruthers launched his career investigating far ultraviolet astronomy.
One of the projects that I came to do was to look for molecular hydrogen in interstellar space, which could be detected only by the use of ultraviolet spectroscopy.
The discovery of this interstellar gas yielded insight into how stars form. Applying his engineering expertise, Carruthers next developed a far ultraviolet spectrograph camera, which in 1972 traveled to the moon on the Apollo 16 mission.
This was the first time that the Earth had been photographed from a distance in ultraviolet light so that you could see the full extent of the hydrogen atmosphere, the polar auroras, and what we call the tropical air glow belt.
Today, that camera still stands. Since then, the instrument has imaged a comet from Skylab and flown on several shuttle missions. This pioneering space scientist remains devoted to helping the next generation realize their dreams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Outstanding.